Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I'm doing fabulously, thank you very much, and all the better for being with you this evening. So before we get started, don't forget to get that quintessential perfect drink, whether it's a cappuccino, whether it's a nice ice-cold glass of white wine, whatever it is, go and get it, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Kira and I'm from Claren Bridge, which means Small Broad Bridge, which is a small village approximately 15 minutes south of Galway in Ireland. It is on the main route from Galway to Limerick, which is at the mouth of the Claren River, west of the village of Dunbalchan Bay, where they harvest the world-famous Claren Bridge oysters, which are considered to be the best oysters in the entire world. I grew up in the 1980s in an old-fashioned village cottage-style home made of stone with a thatched roof and some modern brick conversions added to the rear side of the property due to the large extended size of our family. I was raised with 5 brothers and 4 sisters, so life was never ever dull. And we were a close, loving Irish family that never wanted for anything, although we weren't very well off in those days, but that never seemed to matter. Obviously, we wore each other's hand-me-downs and shared toys and sweets together, but love in our household was in abundant supply, and life in those days was incredibly good. One day my mother announced that our great-aunt Hilda had sent us a single air ticket for one of us kids to go and stay with her in North America, as she would like to get to know one of her nieces or nephews a little better, as during the potato famine in 1845, a portion of our family had remained in Ireland, while the rest had emigrated to the States. My mother would have to decide upon which one of us would go to America, which wasn't an easy decision for her to have to undertake. As kids, who had never so much as ventured outside of Ireland before, the very idea of going abroad tickled our fancies, and we all begged our parents individually that they would consider selecting us over our siblings to go. Over dinner we waited with bated breath to see who was going to be the lucky one to visit North America, and I prayed with all my heart that it would be me. In those days going overseas was a huge deal and a great privilege, and was something more inclined for people of wealth to undertake. "It's unfortunate that you can't all go to America," said my mother. "I do so wish things were different for us financially, but they aren't. If I had my way, I would send the lot of you over, but unfortunately only one of you can go. But the good news is that the one of you that does go can come back and tell us all about it. I'll let you know tomorrow night who will be going, as I have asked the good Lord to show me which one of you he has chosen to send." The following morning my mother shook me wide awake, as usual I'd overslept and needed to get up for school, and I was always the one in our family that tended to oversleep. We both nearly jumped out of our skins when a frog darted out of our bedspread, surprising the both of us. "Where on earth did that come from?" asked my mother, looking perturbed. "It gave me quite a start," she said, picking up the frog and dropping it out of the window so that it was free to hop away to the nearby pond at the back of the yard. "You should be happy," said my sister Emma. "When there's a frog in the house, it means more money is on its way." "Well, I won't say no to that," said my mother. "We could do with a little more nectar coming our way, couldn't we?" Which was my mother's word that she used for money. "Oh, I'd love to take you kids out shopping and go completely ballistic over the clothes section at the department store, without burning any holes in my wallet. It would be wonderful. Imagine how much fun it would be." "Maybe one day," said my sister Emma dreamily. "Who knows? The tide can turn." Later that afternoon my mother picked me up from my ballet lesson at the town hall, and a random large seagull flew over our car and deliberately eliminated and ejected its monstrously milky discharge from its rear end like a shooting water pistol over our windscreen, and the wipers had one hell of a time cleaning the muck off the glass. "Look at that," said my mother, laughing. "A volcanic explosion of bird droppings. I'd love to know the contents of that bird's stomach. My guess is he stole some poor fisherman's sandwich. That evening, all 10 of us kids gathered around the long wooden oak table in our cosy kitchen, while my mother labelled us out big bowls of piping hot leek and potato soup, served with large chunks of Irish soda bread. In our kitchen, the enthused, animated voices became very excitable, because before long my mother would announce who would be going to America, and the mood around the dinner table was very bright and cheerful. We said grace, and then a lone butterfly landed in my soup and almost drowned. I had to gently lift it out with my spoon and wipe down its pretty blue and yellow wings with my napkin, and we watched it fly away out of the kitchen window. "Poor thing," said my father. "Not a pretty place to land, in your soup bowl of all things." "Shh," said my mother. "Please calm down, everybody," she said, tapping her glass down heavily on the table, as the sound of excited chatter and clanging dishes was unusually noisy, which wasn't uncommon in the O'Brien household. "Shh," I said. "Everybody, please be quiet. Mum is trying to speak." And suddenly all the chirrupy voices around the table subsided, and everybody became very quiet. "I'm going to be telling you who is going to America before we eat our steak and kidney pudding," my mother announced. The hushed silence in the room intensified as everyone was eager to hear what my mother had to say. I could see every eye was glued to her, and fists were clenched so tightly, and I noted 2 of my brothers had actually squeezed their eyes tightly shut. "Don't keep us in suspense, love," said my father. "It's killing me. I'll be having a coronary if you don't spit it out right now. Who is going, for goodness sake? Don't keep us hanging on." "Well," said my mother, "as you know, I asked the good Lord to reveal to me who it was that should be going to America. What you did not know is that I also asked him for 3 physical signs from the universe, which I have received. This morning a frog pounced out of Kira's bed, and when I picked her up from the dance class this morning, the contents of a seagull's stomach were splattered all over our windscreen on our drive back home. And last but not least, in front of all of you, a butterfly landed in her soup. It is very clear to me that God has chosen Kira." Everybody clapped. "I'm so happy for you, Kira," they all said. But I could see the downcast expressions in their eyes, and I was overwhelmed with feelings of impending guilt. "Look, Mother," I said, "put all the names in the hat, and we'll do a draw that way. That way we can't argue with who actually wins." "Oh, no," said my father. "Do we have to drag this out a moment longer? I think it's about time we ate our second course. That steak and kidney pudding is calling me from the oven. It smells delicious, and my stomach is rumbling it's turning around so much." "You're just going to have to wait, sweetheart, aren't you?" "If you're sure, Kira, about this, that's very generous of you," said my mother, writing down all my siblings' names and then putting them in a hat and offering the hat to my brother Keegan, who fiddled around in the hat and finally pulled out a name. "So what does it say?" asked my father. "It's Kira," he said, putting the paper down firmly on the table. After the draw, my siblings were unanimous that I was most certainly the one to go to America, because God had clearly singled me out for favour, and I'm not going to pretend that I was absolutely thrilled, because I was, and now I could not argue with the fact that I most definitely had been chosen, as sometimes things are just meant to be. I was 15 years old when I visited America in the spring of 1982, and as the taxi cab drove me from the airport to my Aunt Hilda's farmhouse, I could not contain the rising level of excitement and exhilaration I felt. I could feel my heart fluttering in my chest, and I couldn't erase the broad grin on my face. America seemed so large and spacious, and everything was sprawled out over a vast area that seemed to go on for an eternity, unlike Ireland, where everything was so small and contained. I sat transfixed, glued to the taxi window, mesmerised and beguiled by the scenic vistas of beautiful farms, fields of crops, charming meadows filled with grazing cows or horses, pretty red barns, undulating green countryside, and ubiquitous trees. It was the most exciting, enthralling feeling in the world to be visiting a strange, unusual and new country for the very first time in my life. "You're from Ireland," said the taxi driver, smiling at me through the rear-view mirror in his vehicle. "So, what do you think of America?" "It's beautiful," I said. "Simply beautiful. I love it." "Well, it is spring," said the driver, "and here in the bluegrass state, everything looks marvellous in the spring," he said, pointing at the pretty white blossoms of the service berries, along with the bright pink flowers of the eastern redbuds. "It's gorgeous," I admitted. "I love spring." "You see that beautiful white blossom tree over there?" said the taxi driver. "That's a Bradford pear, and when that starts to flower, we know that spring is here. And then, of course, all the yellow daffodils come out, and you find them coming up everywhere in pretty clusters. Spring is beautiful here." "It is lovely," I agreed. The taxi eventually began to drive deeper and deeper into the heart of the idyllic, exquisite countryside, which was surrounded by high grassy embankments, lined with blossoming red maples, dogwoods and oak trees. Before long we drove through a dark-stained wooden gate, with the sign Misty Frisian Hills attached to the top wooden beam. "Ah, we're here," said the taxi driver. "At last! This must be your Aunt Hilda's property." I sat at the window, completely bewitched by the resplendent scenery, as we drove down a pebbly driveway, past acres and acres of rolling, bright emerald-green countryside that glistened in the morning sun, where the blackest, most magnificent horses that I've ever seen were out grazing in the fields. Surely my aunt didn't own all this, I thought in astonishment. I mean, that would make her incredibly rich, wouldn't it? Finally, the taxi drew up outside a very attractive-looking two-storey farmhouse that was painted in lemon yellow, with pale blue shutters, large windows, and a pale blue, rather ornate front door. All of a sudden, I saw what I can only describe as an exotic butterfly emerging out of the house, with such an excitable look upon her face. It was my great-aunt Hilda, who was effusive, fulsome, and dramatic, and dressed in line with her bubbly personality, as she wore soft, flowing, bright-coloured bohemian clothes, along with a turquoise headband over her head and long, dangling golden earrings. I'd never met anyone quite like her before, and even the taxi driver looked beguiled by this bubbly, ebullient woman, with her vibrant, effervescent, sparkling personality. The woman cradled me in her arms and began to cry. "Oh, do mind me," she said gushingly. "But it's just so wonderful to see you. How I have longed for this day. I only wish all of you kids could have come, but that would have been too big a price tag to pay. As managing my farm with all my Frisian horses doesn't come very cheap." As you can imagine, I was having the time of my life with Aunt Hilda, despite the vast age difference between us, and I never felt that generational gap, as it would seem that I was spending time with someone who is so full of fun, and we did many wonderful things together. I was taken by my aunt to see wineries and breweries and visit farms, cemetery and museums, and taste all kinds of American food, and of course so much more, and I felt as if I'd known Aunt Hilda all of my life. Every morning I would get up eagerly at the crack of dawn to make my way to the large glamorous stable block, to take a long ride on Churchill, my aunt's elegant Frisian horse. There was a gleaming black colour and had a powerfully muscled body, with a thick black mane and glorious tail, with feathering on his lower legs, and he possessed the most gentile, docile, easy-going personality, and in my eyes was quite the most incredible horse that I've ever met in my entire life, and for some reason there was an instantaneous bond between the two of us. I'm a naturally adventurous person by nature, and have always been a huge risk-taker, and enjoy challenging myself. And on this particular morning I decided to follow what had once been an ancient horse trail, and was clearly now abandoned and no longer in use. I could see why it had been neglected, because it was quite a precipitous trail, with rugged outcrops and some steep uphill riding, and there were many tree branches scattered liberally around the countryside, some way too big for me to move myself, but luckily Churchill knew how to navigate the tumultuous terrain and made light work of jumping over any obtrusive treefall. After riding up a steep hilly incline, finally we arrived at a really pretty silvery stream that gushed through the valley with a forceful current. I dismounted Churchill and left her to graze and forage for a while in an open meadow, while I sat down on a large rocky outcrop with hands over my knees to watch the water pulsating over the smooth rocks and pebbles. I've always loved listening to gushing water and watching it. It somehow tends to put me into a tranquil, meditative state. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring into space, but before long I was lost in my thoughts, when a movement behind me suddenly got my attention aroused, and I turned around very swiftly. What was that, I wondered? I'd clearly heard a rustling of leaves, and the sound of very heavy feet moving towards me. It sounded like a bag of heavy potatoes dropping or thumping to the ground with every step. Had I imagined things, I wondered, but then I heard the sound again, very, very clearly. Twigs and leaves were being snapped under feet and broken. And it wasn't Churchill, because he was much further away, grazing happily in the long grass, blindly oblivious to my dilemma. I sat still, gazing in the direction where I believed the sound was coming from. I didn't feel afraid, but I was rather curious, for whoever was walking my way was very sizable and hefty. Maybe it was a very big person, I thought to myself, someone of ample size taking a walk. I could hear the snapping sound again, and then I could see this thorny briar being torn apart as a creature moved through it and yanked it away like you would a piece of candy floss. I mean, who in their right mind walks through a thicket of thorns without being ripped to shreds? Not anyone normal. At first I thought I was seeing a bear, as I suddenly saw this dark brown shadowy form breaking off the twigs and thundering past me, barely noticing me at first. Then this big bear-like creature stopped, as if it had suddenly become aware of my presence, and his head and shoulders swiveled around very slowly to look directly at me. I was astonished to discover that this creature was not a bear, for it had a human-like face, but what was it? I was terrified, for never in my whole life have I ever observed such an intimidating, imposing creature with such a consummate, masterful and formidable presence. It felt as if I was in striking distance of a savage beast, for this being looked to be half human and ape, almost as if someone had been experimenting with human and ape DNA in a science laboratory and merging them together to create a new life form. And this was the outlandish result. At a guess, the arresting creature was easily 8 foot tall, and was very stocky and well built, with a dense muscular anatomy, especially across the torso region and upper shoulders, and was covered with magnificent raven black hair, like Churchill the horse, and the hair looked incredibly well groomed, but layered and thick. I noted it had long arms, much like that of a primate, and the head shape of a silverback gorilla, and more of a human-like face, although the forehead was very prominent and heavily furrowed, while the eyes deep-set and dark, and the nose almost as flat as a pug. On this particular occasion, the soft easterly wind had been blowing in the opposite direction, and I'd been so entwined in a still meditative moment, which was why the creature had not discerned me or picked up my human scent on the wind, as I am certain, if that were not indeed the case, I would never have had such a chance anomalous encounter. The creature looked at me with deep-set chocolate-coloured eyes, and those eyes darted towards my hands. Maybe he wondered if I was carrying a gun, for when he saw I was unarmed, I noted the tension in his face lifted, and he visibly began to relax. I was so afraid that I sat as still as an ice statue, completely incapacitated by the most dreadful, all-consuming fear, the likes that I have never known before or since. The creature still stared at me like you and I would regard a painting, and I know it sounds crazy and nonsensical, but I felt like this strange being was either reading my energy or looking directly through me like a pane of glass. I could see the taut rigidity and tightness of the creature's jaw subside, and his muscles relaxed even more, as he sensed that I was no danger to him, and I was clearly no threat. Then he did the strangest, most peculiar thing. He scratched his head in front of me in deep contemplation, and then spoke a couple of rather musical high-pitched words in a language I could not comprehend, and I felt as if those words were directed at me. But I have no notion of what he was saying, although I wish I did. I watched in reverent awe as the majestic, lofty creature darted towards the stream, and I saw him standing in the water like bears do during the salmon run, and he began attempting to catch fish with a stick that had a jagged edge, and he was seemingly unperturbed at this stage by my presence. You would think that at this point I would have made a hasty exit out of the place as fast as I could, but it was like I was locked in some kind of a stupefied, suspended trance, and I couldn't stop staring in wondrous awe at the creature, with a look of transfixed bewilderment on my face. I kept rubbing my eyes to assure myself that I was not dreaming. All of a sudden the creature swerved his body to one side with such swift speed and agility, in coordination with his powerful swinging arms, that he thrashed forward so powerfully like a golfer hitting the ball to stab and pierce the fish with a stick, and he whacked it against his shoulder and left it there hanging until he had caught 2 more of them. The creature glided out of the water with 3 brown trout dangling in his hands, which he had tied together with twine. Upon seeing me, he stood still for a moment as if he was making a decision, much like a kid who has 3 sweets but doesn't want to share any at all, and has a hard time parting with even one of them, but does so anyway with a degree of reluctant disinclination, knowing that it is the right thing to do after all, for it would be greedy to consume them without sharing. It was like that with the creature, as he studied his 3 fish intently, and then graciously handed me one, which I took from him, for it would have been rude not to accept his courteous, kind-hearted offer, even if it was given to me with a degree of hesitancy on his part. I then saw him pull back the thorny briars again and glide through them, from whence he'd initially come, glancing back at me briefly for one more time, as if he was saying goodbye. I think on his part it had taken a lot for the creature to give me one of his fish, and I was secretly moved by his spontaneous act of generosity. It left me to conclude that this creature had been raised by parents who had clearly taught him the art of good manners and of male chivalry, which some parents have all but failed to accomplish with their own human prodigy. My fear turned to elation, and running with my fish I darted back to Churchill, mounting him enthusiastically, and galloped quickly back to my Aunt Hilda's house. I couldn't wait to tell her what I'd seen. On this occasion she had invited a guest over for breakfast and was preparing a full fry-up of sausage, bacon, mushrooms and eggs, along with glasses of fresh orange juice. "Where have you been, Kira dear?" she said. "My word, you look so out of breath. Kira, this is Pastor Robert Page, who has an Irish ancestry. I thought you might like to meet him." I could see that this was a young, rather dashing, handsome gentleman, and I wouldn't put anything past Aunt Hilda in trying to instigate some romantic flame between the 2 of us. But did she not realise how much older he was than me? It was never going to happen, despite her best well-meaning intentions. "Hello, Robert," I said. "Very nice to meet you." "Aunt Hilda, you won't believe what's just happened to me back there," I said, handing her the large brown trout. "I was riding Churchill, and you—" "Calm down, dear. Where did you get this beauty from?" said my aunt, examining the trout in amazement. "Who gave you this?" she asked, looking at me with a mystified expression on her face. "A very strange creature, Aunt. It was half human, and it was half ape. You won't believe it." "Kira, what on earth are you talking about, dear? There is no such creature living here in North America," said my aunt, placing her hand on my head to see if I was running a temperature. "Are you sure you're all right, dear?" she said. "I think you do feel rather hot and clammy. I'm worried you might be coming down with something." "Aunt Hilda, I feel hot because I've been out riding Churchill. I'm not running a fever." "You should know that exercise makes you hot," I said. looking exceedingly frustrated. "You can doubt my story as much as you like, Aunt Hilda, but I'm not making this up," I said, reaching for a pen and paper and frantically drawing the creature I'd seen and thrusting it into her face. "Aunt Hilda, that's what I saw." Aunt Hilda studied the picture that I had drawn with a bemused expression on her face and hastily began to serve up our breakfast. "I'm so sorry, Pastor. Well, Kira, being new to America," she laughed dismissively, "has no experience with the wildlife here. I'm quite sure she saw a bear and has just mistaken it for something very, very strange." "Aunt Hilda," I piped, "I'm not a complete, utter idiot. We may not have bears in Ireland, but I assure you I do know what a bear looks like. I have actually been to a zoo before. But this wasn't a bear. It had a human face, only it was covered in hair. Believe me, I'm telling you the truth." "I happen to believe your niece's story, Hilda," said the young pastor. "I think she did see what she claims to have encountered. It isn't the first time I've heard of such an incongruous rendezvous before. For indeed my father spoke of a similar experience that had occurred to him after a member of his congregation had visited him because of huge issues to do with anxiety." "Really?" said Aunt Hilda. "Well, what happened?" "Well, my father told me the whole story. It happened in the June of 1965. The young man in question was called Brodie, and he came to tell my father that he believed that God was punishing him because he had done something very iniquitous and evil, and that as a result he was now being visited by a demon, and he was very, very afraid. He claimed that during the night he would wake up to see this huge, hairy face with bright red eyes staring at him through the bedroom window. Brodie was in such a dreadful state, and he was shaking all over like a jelly. Very discomposed he was. My father asked him if he would feel better confessing his sin to him in person, and Brodie hung his head in shame and said, "May God forgive me for what I've done, Father. Truly, I am very ashamed. I stole some money from an old lady. A lot of money," he stammered, his face growing red with embarrassment. "I know I should not have done such an irreverent and heathen thing, Father. I think it was all her life savings that she kept in a pillow under her bed." I learnt about her secret stash of money because I was friends with her grandson, who told me that his grandmother was not trusting of any banks, so she hid her money in one of her pillows. I climbed through the open window when the woman was out shopping and stole all her money, and I spent it all. Oh, Father, I am so ashamed. After I'd done this profane thing, I felt such self-disgust and revulsion, and I've been tormented ever since, for I have seen a demon outside my window a couple of times at night, and I am terrified he is intending on taking me back to the fiery pit of hell. Father, what should I do?" "So you took this old lady's money," my father said to Brodie in disgust. "That is a shocking, immoral thing for you to do. You know how protective our Heavenly Father is towards the orphan and the widow. You have done a grievous, very shameful thing, but the Lord is faithful to forgive the repentant heart. But I think you need to make restitution to the poor widow, for you cannot deprive her of her life savings, as that is indeed reprehensible and sacrilegious." "I'll do anything, Father. Anything to make amends," piped Brodie. "I just can't pay the money back, because I spent it all. Otherwise I would return it to her in a heartbeat. Anything to stop that demon from coming back." "Well, I believe you, Brodie. There are ways you can make up for your misdemeanours. You do have the ability to work, have you not?" "Of course, Father. Anything you suggest, you name it, I'll do it." My father decided that the church would give the old woman all her money back that had been stolen by Brodie, and got him to return the money to the old lady in person and to apologise profusely for what he had done. Thankfully, she hadn't realised the money had been stolen, as Brodie had surreptitiously filled her pillow with newspaper cuttings. Even so, the woman gave Brodie her blessing
and assured him that he was indeed forgiven. I gather she was a lovely, gentle old dear, and not a bad bone in her body was seen.
"We all make mistakes, Brodie," she said, "but you understood the error of your ways, and as you have returned my money, why should I be aggrieved?" In return for the church's help, Brodie had to compensate the church. He was to clean it up every Sunday after the people had left the service, including cleaning up all the toilets, which wasn't a job for the faint-hearted, and he was also expected to help the old lady keep her house clean and do any shopping and chores for her during the week, and the old lady and Brodie became the best of friends, but that is a whole other story. Of course, Brodie begged my father to visit his home that evening and make intercession for him by praying for his soul to our loving Father and sprinkling holy water all over the place. My father said he discovered that outside Brodie's bedroom window was the biggest footprint he'd ever seen, that was too big to be made by a regular man, nor was it made by a bear. My father was well acquainted with bear tracks from his hunting days as a boy, so he knew the intruder outside the window was not a bear, and if he had looked through the Brodie's window, he would have had to have been easily 8 foot tall. This was when he came to the startling revelation that the demonical being staring in at Brodie's room at night was not of a supernatural origin, but was clearly physical. But he was puzzled as to what it was that Brodie had actually seen. "I understood from my father that Brodie lived here in the Bluegrass State, on one of those remote roads, and as my father was leaving Brodie's cabin in the woods, the headlights of his black Dodger Charger lit up a creature in the dirt road. My father was so astonished that he stalled the car and struggled to get it to start again. Of course, he could not believe what he was seeing, and described the creature as being 8 foot tall and exceedingly wide, with a huge barrel chest and massive shoulders, and appeared to be covered in long flowing dark hair, blacker than black. He described the creature as having the face of a man. It cowered in the light of my father's headlights, as it seemed to detest the light that was streaming in its eyes. But it looked directly at my father in the front passenger seat, and my father said in certain lights the creature's eyes exhibited a red eye shine. But my father wasn't afraid, despite the fact that the creature was intimidating in presence to behold. But as a man of God, he sensed the creature meant no harm, and described it as having beautiful, kind eyes. My father believed that eyes were indeed the windows of the soul, conveying the very heart of a man. My father said the creature glided away, moving with such grace into the darkness of the night. It was easy to see such a creature could easily have been mistaken or misconstrued for a demon. He was certain that this curious creature had probably been staring in Brodie's bedroom window at night, scaring the man half to death. My father began to laugh so much on his return journey home, saying that the good Lord had a great sense of humour, for Brodie had been brought to repentance as a result of this elusive creature staring at him through the window at night that he so believed was a demon. "Wow," I said. "You see, Aunt Hilda, I wasn't making it up. The creature is real, it exists, and I'm willing to bet you, Robert, that your father saw exactly what I saw."
"I think it's very likely indeed," said Robert.
"But I don't understand," said Aunt Hilda. "Why do we not know about these things then?"
"Because, Hilda," said Robert reflectively, "wouldn't it be a very boring world if we knew the answers to everything? I think an aura of mystery in our lives makes the world a very exciting place indeed."
As you can imagine, when I left Aunt Hilda's home in North America to return to Ireland, I was able to tell all my excited siblings some incredible stories about my amazing North American trip around a crackling fire at night, with all eyes pinned on me, growing wider and wider as I told my extraordinary story. For no one doubted it to be true, for here in Ireland we believe in the fae and in elves and goblins, so why not this elusive mythical beast? All my siblings began to speculate what the incongruous creature was that I encountered, and it was only 15 years ago that I realised I had a one-on-one encounter with a Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. If you enjoyed it, Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, goodbye and good night.